The morning of April 15, 1943, broke cold and grey over RAF Debden in Essex, England. Captain Don Blakesley stood on the hardstand, arms crossed, staring at the massive aircraft that had just been delivered to his 4th Fighter Group. The P-47 Thunderbolt dwarfed everything around it. Compared to the sleek Spitfires his men had been flying, this American brute looked like someone had strapped wings to a water tower. "Jesus Christ," muttered Lieutenant Jim Goodson beside him. "That thing's got to weigh 7 tons. 7.5, actually," Blakesley replied, walking slowly around the aircraft. 13,000 pounds empty, nearly 8 tons loaded for combat. The P-47C sat there like a defiant statement of American industrial might. Its enormous radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, dominated the front end. 18 cylinders producing 2,000 horsepower on war emergency power. The fuselage was thick, almost portly, housing the complex turbo supercharger system that would allow this monster to fight at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. Goodson ran his hand along the wing route. "The boys aren't happy about giving up their Spits." "The boys will learn to love her," Blakesley said firmly. "Or they'll die in her. Either way, this is what we're flying." What neither man knew that morning was that they were looking at the aircraft that would fundamentally change the air war over Europe. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt would become the most produced American fighter of World War II, with over 15,000 built. More importantly, it would earn a reputation that made Luftwaffe pilots genuinely fear seeing its distinctive silhouette appear in their gun sights. The story of the Thunderbolt began not in the heat of combat, but in the offices of Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York. Chief designer Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant with an engineer's mind and a pragmatist's soul, had watched the air war in Europe with growing concern. The early reports from 1940 and 1941 were clear. Fighters needed altitude performance, heavy armament, and above all, survivability. Kartveli's design philosophy was radical for its time. Where other designers sought to minimize weight and maximize agility, he decided to build a fighter around the most powerful engine available and accept the weight that came with it. The R2800 engine was a monster that required a sophisticated cooling and induction system. Rather than try to streamline everything into a minimal package, Kartveli embraced the bulk. The result was an aircraft that looked wrong to conventional eyes. The fuselage was wide and deep. The wings were thick. The whole aircraft seemed too big, too heavy, too ungainly to be an effective fighter. Army Air Force brass looked at the prototypes with skepticism. Then they flew it. Test pilot Lowry Brabham took the XP-47B prototype up for the first time on May 6, 1941. He climbed to 15,000 feet in 5 minutes. He pushed the throttle forward and felt the big Pratt & Whitney howl. The speedometer needle swept past 400 miles per hour. At altitude, with the turbo supercharger doing its work, the P-47 could reach speeds that made it one of the fastest fighters in the world. But speed wasn't the Thunderbolt's only trick. Brabham put the aircraft through violent maneuvers, yanking the stick back hard, throwing it into rolls and loops. The airframe didn't flex or creak. It felt solid, planted, immensely strong. This wasn't a delicate thoroughbred that needed gentle handling. This was a warhorse that could take punishment and keep fighting. The armament sealed the deal. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they could put out 100 rounds per second. The combined weight of fire was devastating. A 1-second burst delivered 425 grams of lead and incendiary projectiles. A 2-second burst could saw the wing off a Bf-109 or shred the fuselage of an FW-190. By late 1942, P-47s were arriving in England. The 56th Fighter Group, the 78th Fighter Group, and Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group began transitioning to the type. The pilots, many of whom had been flying Spitfires or P-38 Lightnings, approached their new mount with a mixture of curiosity and dread. The first impression was always the same. This thing is huge. Getting into a P-47 required climbing up onto the wing and then stepping over the side into the cockpit. The pilot sat high, perched atop the massive fuselage, with excellent visibility in most directions. The instrument panel was comprehensive, almost overwhelming. Throttle, mixture, propeller pitch, turbo control, fuel selector, oxygen, guns, radio. A new pilot had to memorize the startup sequence perfectly or risk embarrassing himself in front of his crew chief. Starting the R-2800 was a ritual. Prime the cylinders, crack the throttle, engage the starter. The inertia starter would wind up with a rising whine, and then, at just the right moment, you'd engage the mesh. The big propeller would begin to turn slowly, reluctantly, and then one cylinder would fire, then another, and suddenly the whole engine would explode into life with a thunderous roar that shook the entire aircraft. Taxiing required care. The P-47 was a taildragger, and visibility forward on the ground was terrible. Pilots had to S-turn down the taxiway, weaving left and right to see where they were going. The aircraft was heavy, and once it got rolling, it wanted to keep rolling. More than one pilot embarrassed himself by running off the taxiway or tapping the aircraft in front of him. But once you got her into the air, everything changed. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group remembered his first flight vividly. "I was scared to death when I first saw the P-47. It looked like it shouldn't be able to fly at all. But when I took off and climbed up to 20,000 feet, I fell in love. She was stable as a rock. She was fast. And she felt incredibly solid. You knew that airplane could take a beating." The learning curve was steep. The P-47 was not a forgiving aircraft for the careless or untrained. It had some quirks that could kill an unwary pilot. The most dangerous was the torque roll. The massive engine produced enormous torque, and if a pilot tried to climb too steeply at low speed, the aircraft could snap into an uncontrollable roll to the left. Several pilots died in training accidents before everyone learned to respect the Thunderbolt's power. But once pilots mastered her, they began to appreciate what they had. The P-47 could dive faster than anything in the sky. Pilots discovered they could build up tremendous speed in a dive and then use that speed to zoom climb back to altitude, extending away from enemy fighters that couldn't match their energy retention. The first combat mission was flown on March 10, 1943. The 4th Fighter Group escorted bombers on a raid to Rouen. The mission was uneventful, no enemy contact, but it marked the beginning of the P-47's operational career in Europe. The Luftwaffe's first encounters with the Thunderbolt were confusing. German pilots were accustomed to fighting Spitfires and the occasional P-38. The Spitfire was nimble and turned well, but was vulnerable at high altitude and had limited range. The P-38 was distinctive with its twin booms, but had compressibility problems in dives. Then this new American fighter appeared. It was huge, bigger than anything the Germans had seen. It flew high, often at 28 or 30,000 feet. It was fast, especially in a dive. And when German fighters tried to bounce it from above, the P-47 pilots would simply push over into a steep dive and accelerate away at speeds the German fighters couldn't match. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke of JG-11 wrote in his diary after an early encounter, "A new American fighter has appeared, very large, very fast, especially in the dive. We tried to catch one today, but it simply accelerated away from us. Our FW-190s cannot match it in a dive. This is concerning." The early months of 1943 were a period of learning for both sides. P-47 pilots learned that they couldn't dogfight with Bf-109s and FW-190s at low altitude. The German fighters were more maneuverable, especially in the horizontal. But up high, above 25,000 feet, the P-47 was king. The turbo supercharger gave it power at altitudes where German engines struggled. Pilots developed tactics. Hit and run became the doctrine. Dive from altitude, make one high-speed pass, and then zoom climb back up to altitude. Don't try to turn with the enemy, use your speed and altitude advantage. Captain Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group was one of the early innovators. A hard-driving commander with a genius for tactics, Zemke trained his pilots relentlessly. "Height is life," he preached. "Speed is life. Never give up either one willingly." By April 1943, the P-47 groups were beginning to score kills. The learning curve was steep, and some pilots died learning lessons that others would survive because of. But slowly, inexorably, the American pilots were figuring out how to use their massive, powerful fighter effectively. On April 15th, exactly 1 month after the type's combat debut, the 4th Fighter Group engaged FW-190s over the Channel. Blakesley shot down 2. It was the beginning of his remarkable combat career in the Thunderbolt. But it was also the beginning of something larger. The Luftwaffe was about to discover that this ungainly American brute was far more dangerous than it appeared. The P-47 Thunderbolt was about to earn its nickname, the Flying Tank, and Luftwaffe pilots were about to learn to fear it. June 26, 1943. The date Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson would never forget. Johnson was leading his flight of 4 P-47s back from an escort mission deep into occupied France. They'd mixed it up with German fighters near Paris, and Johnson had become separated from his wingman. At 24,000 feet, alone, he spotted a lone FW-190 below him. The temptation was irresistible. Johnson pushed over into a dive, building speed. The Focke-Wulf grew larger in his gun sight. He pressed the trigger. 8 .50 calibers roared. Tracers reached out. Pieces flew off the German fighter. But at that exact moment, Johnson's canopy exploded. He'd been jumped. An entire staffel of FW-190s had been waiting, using their lone comrade as bait. Cannon shells walked up Johnson's fuselage. His instrument panel disintegrated. His windscreen shattered. A 20mm shell exploded in the cockpit, and shrapnel tore into his right hand. Johnson's instinct was to bail out, but something made him stay with the aircraft. He pushed the stick forward, diving for the deck. The FW-190s followed, firing continuously. More hits. The P-47 shuddered with each impact. The right wing took several cannon shells. The tail was perforated. The fuselage looked like a colander. At 10,000 feet, Johnson leveled off and pushed the throttle to war emergency power. The R-2800 engine, despite having taken multiple hits, continued to run. The big fighter accelerated. The FW-190s stayed with him, but they were burning fuel at a tremendous rate trying to keep up. For 15 minutes, the running battle continued. The Germans fired over 200 cannon shells at Johnson's P-47. Many hit. Johnson's aircraft was being destroyed around him, but it kept flying. The control surfaces were shredded, but still responded. The engine ran rough, but still produced power. The airframe held together despite gaping holes throughout. Finally, over the Channel, the FW-190s broke off. They were out of ammunition and fuel. Johnson, bleeding from multiple wounds, his aircraft barely controllable, nursed the dying Thunderbolt across the water. He made it to RAF Manston, declared an emergency, and landed. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his crew chief counted the damage. Over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes. Parts of the wing were missing. The tail looked like Swiss cheese. But Johnson was alive. The P-47 had brought him home. The incident was documented, photographed, and became legendary. Republic Aviation used Johnson's aircraft as proof of the Thunderbolt's incredible toughness. Luftwaffe intelligence noted the incident with concern. This American fighter could apparently absorb damage that would have destroyed any German aircraft. The P-47's reputation for survivability wasn't an accident. Alexander Kartveli had designed the aircraft with redundancy and protection in mind. The pilot sat behind an armored windscreen and had an armored seatback. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, containing layers of rubber that would swell when punctured by bullets, closing the holes. Critical systems had multiple routings and backups. But the real secret was the airframe itself. The Thunderbolt was built like a bridge. Massive spars ran through the wings. The fuselage structure was overbuilt, stronger than it needed to be for normal flight. The tail was mounted high, away from the fuselage, making it harder to shoot off. Everything was robust, heavy, and tough. By the summer of 1943, P-47 pilots had developed supreme confidence in their aircraft's ability to take punishment. This confidence translated into aggressiveness. They pressed attacks when more cautious pilots would have broken off. They fought when outnumbered. They knew that even if they took hits, the P-47 would probably get them home. Hauptmann Johannes Naumann of JG-26 wrote in a report, "The American Thunderbolt is extraordinarily durable. We have observed aircraft with severe battle damage, including hits from 30mm cannon, that continue to fly and fight. Pilots must aim for the cockpit or engine if they wish to ensure a kill. Body hits, even multiple hits, may not be sufficient." The Luftwaffe's concern about the P-47 deepened as the summer progressed. More fighter groups were converting to the type. The 56th, 4th, 78th, 352nd, and 353rd fighter groups were all flying Thunderbolts by August 1943. That meant dozens of these heavy fighters were appearing over Germany on every major raid. The Germans tried various tactics. They attempted head-on attacks, reasoning that the P-47's heavy engine would provide a larger target. This worked sometimes, but the Thunderbolt's 8 guns firing directly forward meant that head-on passes were extremely dangerous for both sides. More than one Luftwaffe pilot pressed a head-on attack, only to have his aircraft disintegrate under the tremendous firepower of a P-47's frontal armament. They tried diving attacks from above, the classic bounce. But P-47 pilots learned to watch their 6 o'clock religiously. The Thunderbolt's excellent rearward visibility from the high cockpit meant that bounces were often spotted early. And if the bounce was spotted, the P-47 pilot would simply push over into a dive of his own. No German fighter could match the Thunderbolt's dive speed. Many Bf-109s experienced control problems or even structural failure trying to stay with a diving P-47. The Germans tried low-altitude ambushes, staying down in the weeds where the P-47's turbo supercharger advantage disappeared. This worked better. At 5,000 feet and below, the FW-190 and Bf-109 were more maneuverable. But American pilots learned not to chase German fighters down to the deck. Stay high. Keep your energy. Let the enemy come up to you. Colonel Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group became particularly effective. Zemke was a demanding commander who insisted on discipline and aggressive tactics. His pilots learned to work as teams, covering each other, setting up traps, maintaining altitude advantage. By September 1943, the 56th was the highest-scoring P-47 group in the 8th Air Force. The mission of October 8, 1943, demonstrated the maturity of American fighter tactics. The target was Bremen. The bomber stream was escorted by over 200 P-47s and relays. The Luftwaffe threw up everything it had, over 300 fighters. The sky over Germany became a massive, swirling dogfight. Major Jerry Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group led his squadron into a formation of Bf-110 twin-engine fighters that were trying to attack the bombers. The P-47s tore into the German formation. The 50 caliber guns were devastating against the larger, less maneuverable Bf-110s. Johnson personally shot down 3. His squadron destroyed 12 without loss. Meanwhile, Captain Walker Mahurin encountered a group of Bf-109s. Rather than engage in a turning fight, Mahurin led his flight in a slashing attack, diving through the German formation, firing briefly, and then zoom-climbing back to altitude. The Germans scattered, trying to follow, but the P-47s were gone, climbing back to 30,000 feet on the power of their supercharged engines. The Germans, their engines gasping in the thin air, couldn't follow. The mission cost the Luftwaffe 30 fighters shot down. The Americans lost 7 P-47s. The exchange ratio was improving, but the greatest test was yet to come. In early 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Big Week, a series of massive raids designed to destroy the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, struck targets across Germany. The Luftwaffe was forced to defend. The air battles were the most intense of the war. On February 20, 1944, the mission to Leipzig turned into the largest air battle in history up to that point. Over 1,000 American aircraft penetrated deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe responded with over 400 fighters. P-47s from multiple groups engaged German formations across a 200-mile front. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski of the 56th Fighter Group, the leading P-47 ace, led his squadron against a formation of Bf-109s near Magdeburg. There were at least 40 of them, Gabreski recalled. My squadron had 16 aircraft. Normal doctrine would say, don't attack when outnumbered. But we had altitude, we had speed, and we had confidence in our aircraft. We attacked. The P-47s dove through the German formation, guns blazing. The Bf-109s scattered. Some tried to dive away, but the P-47s were faster. Some tried to turn and fight, but the American pilots refused to get drawn into a turning engagement. They made high-speed passes, fired, and extended away before climbing back up. Gabreski shot down 2 Bf-109s in the first pass. He climbed back to altitude, positioned for another attack, and dove again. On his third pass, he damaged a third Bf-109 that later crashed. His wingmen shot down 1. The squadron claimed 7 destroyed for no losses. Similar scenes played out across the sky over Germany that day. The P-47s, operating at their optimal altitude, using tactics refined over months of combat, dominated the German fighters. The Luftwaffe lost 60 fighters that day. The Americans lost 20, but most of those were bombers, not fighters. German commanders were learning a painful lesson. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that ungainly brute they had initially dismissed, had become a dominant force in the air war. It wasn't the most maneuverable fighter. It wasn't the fastest at all altitudes. But it was tough, it was powerful, and in the hands of well-trained pilots using effective tactics, it was deadly. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, wrote in a report to Goering, "The American P-47 has proven to be a formidable opponent. Its durability is exceptional. Our pilots report that aircraft which should have been destroyed continue to fight and return to base. Its heavy armament makes it deadly in the attack. Its high-altitude performance exceeds our own fighters. We must develop new tactics and aircraft to counter this threat." But new tactics took time to develop. New aircraft took even longer. Meanwhile, P-47s continued to arrive in England in increasing numbers. By spring 1944, the 8th Air Force had 7 P-47 groups operational. The 9th Air Force, being built up for the invasion of France, had 9 more groups. Over 700 Thunderbolts were available for operations. The Germans faced a nightmare scenario, fighting a war of attrition against an opponent with vastly superior industrial capacity and increasingly skilled pilots, flying aircraft that could absorb tremendous punishment and still remain combat effective. In April 1944, something new was added to the P-47's mission profile: ground attack. The decision was controversial among pilots who had trained as fighter pilots, not attack pilots. But the Thunderbolt proved as capable in the mud as it was in the sky. April 1944. Captain Quince Brown of the 78th Fighter Group pushed his P-47 down toward the deck, watching the German train rushing along the tracks below. He'd been hunting for targets of opportunity in occupied France for 20 minutes, and this was the best thing he'd found. A locomotive pulling what looked like 20 freight cars, probably carrying supplies for the Atlantic Wall defenses. Brown armed his guns and rockets. The P-47D he was flying was equipped with stubby, zero-length launch rails under each wing, each carrying a 5-inch, high-velocity aircraft rocket. The HVAR packed the punch of a destroyer's 5-inch gun. 10 of them could obliterate almost any ground target. He lined up on the locomotive. The P-47 was steady as a rock at low level, the heavy airframe absorbing the buffeting and turbulence that would have made a lighter fighter dance around. Brown pressed the rocket release. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The rockets leaped off the rails, trailing smoke. They impacted around and on the locomotive in a rippling series of explosions. Then Brown pressed the trigger for his guns. 8 .50 calibers tore into the train. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the locomotive's boiler. Steam erupted. The engine derailed, dragging cars behind it off the tracks. Brown pulled up sharply, banking away as ground fire began reaching up toward him. This was the new mission for the P-47, fighter-bomber operations, what the pilots called mud moving. Initially, many P-47 pilots resented the assignment. They'd trained to be fighter pilots, to engage in aerial combat, not to strafe trains and trucks. But they quickly discovered that the Thunderbolt was as effective at ground attack as it was in air combat. The P-47 could carry a formidable bomb load, up to 2,500 pounds externally. A typical load was one 500-pound bomb under the fuselage and 2 500-pound bombs under the wings, or 2 1,000-pounders and a drop tank. With rockets added to the mix, a single P-47 could deliver more ordnance than a medium bomber of just a few years earlier. But ordnance was only part of the equation. The real advantage was the pilot's ability to find, identify, and attack targets with precision. A bomber flying at 20,000 feet might miss a target by hundreds of yards. A P-47 diving from 5,000 feet could put a bomb within feet of the target. And if the first pass missed, the pilot could make another pass with guns or rockets. The durability that made the P-47 so survivable in air combat proved equally valuable in ground attack. Flak, anti-aircraft fire from the ground, was omnipresent over occupied Europe. Every road, every bridge, every train, every depot had flak guns protecting it. Light flak, 20mm and 37mm guns, spewed shells at low-flying aircraft. A single hit could be catastrophic for a light fighter. But P-47s routinely returned from ground attack missions with dozens of flak holes punched through wings, fuselage, and tail. The robust structure absorbed the damage. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. The radial engine, with its cylinders arranged in a circle, could lose several cylinders to flak damage and continue running on the others. Pilots learned to trust that the Thunderbolt would get them home, even if it looked like it was falling apart. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Bradley of the 358th Fighter Group described a mission in May 1944. We hit a rail yard near Rouen. The flak was intense, everything from light cannon to what seemed like rifles. My aircraft took hits on every pass. By the time I was done, I had over 50 holes in the wings and fuselage. One shell hit the armor plate behind my seat, but didn't penetrate. The engine was running rough, but she got me home. A Spitfire or Mustang would have been shot down. The Jug took it and kept flying. Jug was the affectionate nickname P-47 pilots gave their aircraft. It was short for Juggernaut, reflecting the aircraft's unstoppable, crushing power. The name stuck, and by 1944, almost everyone referred to the P-47 as the Jug. As D-Day approached, the 9th Air Force's P-47 groups intensified their attacks on transportation targets in France. The goal was to isolate the invasion beaches, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the landing zones. Every bridge, every rail line, every road junction became a target. The German army in France began to dread the appearance of American fighters. Unlike the Luftwaffe, which could at least fight back, the Wehrmacht had no effective defense against low-flying fighter bombers. Flak batteries helped, but there were never enough guns to protect every target. German convoys learned to move only at night or in bad weather. Moving in daylight invited disaster. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The invasion of Normandy. The 9th Air Force put over 1,000 aircraft into the air over the invasion beaches. P-47s flew continuous patrols, attacking any German forces trying to reach the beachheads. The 8th Air Force's P-47 groups flew sweeps inland, engaging any Luftwaffe fighters attempting to interfere with the invasion. The Luftwaffe's response was feeble. They could only muster about 100 sorties over the invasion zone on D-Day. Most of those aircraft never reached the beaches. P-47s and other Allied fighters intercepted them. The few that got through accomplished nothing. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group was patrolling over Utah Beach when he spotted a lone Bf-109 attempting to strafe the landing craft. Preddy dove on the German fighter, fired a burst, and watched the 109 tumble into the channel. It was one of only 2 Luftwaffe aircraft shot down over the beaches that day. There simply weren't enough German aircraft to make a difference. But the real work was happening inland. P-47s armed with bombs and rockets systematically destroyed German armored columns trying to reach the front. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, attempting to move from southern France to Normandy, was caught in the open by P-47s of the 405th Fighter Group. For 3 days, American fighters hammered the division. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, artillery pieces, all were destroyed or damaged. The division, which started with over 200 tanks and assault guns, arrived in Normandy with fewer than 100 operational vehicles. German tankers learned to hate the sound of American radial engines. The R-2800's distinctive roar became a death knell. When that sound appeared, everyone scattered, seeking any cover available. But cover was hard to find from an aircraft that could fire rockets from 1,000 yards away. Oberstleutnant Heinz Harmel of the 10th SS Panzer Division wrote, "The American fighter bombers are our greatest problem. They appear suddenly, attack with bombs and rockets, and disappear before our flak can engage effectively. Movement in daylight is nearly impossible. We are losing vehicles faster than they can be replaced. The Thunderbolt in particular is feared because it can absorb our flak and continue its attack." The campaign in France became a shooting gallery for Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe was nearly absent. The few German fighters that appeared were quickly shot down. The P-47 groups transitioned to almost pure ground attack work, flying multiple sorties per day, hitting anything that moved. The effectiveness of the P-47 in ground attack sparked a debate that continues among historians. Some argue that the claims of destroyed tanks and vehicles were exaggerated, that it's difficult to destroy a tank from the air, that fighter bombers cause more disruption than actual destruction. Others point to German records showing massive vehicle losses and the paralysis of German movement. The truth is probably somewhere in between. P-47s didn't destroy every tank they claimed, but they destroyed enough. And more importantly, they made movement so hazardous that German units became paralyzed. A panzer division that can't move is nearly useless. And P-47s, along with other Allied fighters, ensured that German forces could rarely move in daylight without suffering losses. By August 1944, some P-47 groups in the 8th Air Force began transitioning to the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had longer range and better high-altitude performance, making it ideal for the deep escort missions into Germany. The P-47, with its shorter range, was less suitable for those missions. But the P-47 groups that remained in the 8th Air Force continued to rack up victories. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Hub Zemke, refused to transition to Mustangs. They loved their jugs. By war's end, the 56th would be the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force, with 674.5 confirmed aerial victories, all in P-47s. Francis Cabreski became the top American ace in Europe flying P-47s, with 28 confirmed kills. Robert Johnson scored 27 kills. Walker Mahurin scored 20. All in Thunderbolts. The top aces proved that in skilled hands, the P-47 was as deadly as any fighter in the sky. In the Pacific theater, the P-47 also proved its worth. The 5th and 7th Air Forces operated P-47s extensively in the Philippines, Okinawa, and the final assault on Japan. In that theater, the P-47's toughness was even more valuable. Combat over the Pacific meant long flights over water. An aircraft hit by enemy fire had to make it back to base or ditch in the ocean. The P-47's ability to absorb damage and keep flying saved countless pilots. The Japanese also learned to respect the Thunderbolt. Their lighter fighters could turn inside the P-47 easily, but American pilots in the Pacific used the same boom and zoom tactics that worked in Europe. Dive from altitude, make one pass, climb back up. Japanese pilots trying to follow a climbing P-47 found themselves stalling out while the American fighter continued to climb away on the power of its turbocharged engine. By 1945, as the war in Europe ended, the P-47 had compiled an extraordinary record. Over 15,600 aircraft were produced, more than any other American fighter. They flew over 500,000 sorties in Europe alone. They destroyed 7,067 enemy aircraft, with 3,752 destroyed in air combat and 3,315 destroyed on the ground. The kill-to-loss ratio in air combat was approximately 4.6 to 1 in the P-47's favor. But the statistics don't tell the whole story. The real measure of the P-47's success was the impact it had on the Luftwaffe. German pilots who survived the war consistently mentioned the Thunderbolt as one of the most dangerous opponents they faced. Not because it was the fastest or most maneuverable, it wasn't, but because it was everywhere. It was tough, it was heavily armed, and it was flown by increasingly skilled and aggressive pilots. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, in his post-war memoirs, wrote, "The P-47 Thunderbolt represented the American approach to aerial warfare. Overwhelming firepower, robust construction, and the willingness to trade elegance for effectiveness. We in the Luftwaffe built beautiful aircraft that were marvels of engineering. The Americans built the Thunderbolt. In the end, their approach proved more successful." Major Heinz Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's leading aces with over 200 victories, put it more bluntly. "We called it the flying tank. It could take hits that would destroy any of our fighters. Its pilots knew this and fought with corresponding aggressiveness. It was a formidable opponent." After the war, the P-47 had a brief career in the early jet age before being retired from frontline service. But it served in many air forces around the world through the 1950s. The last combat missions by P-47s were flown by the Peruvian Air Force in the 1960s. Today, only a handful of airworthy P-47s remain, cherished and maintained by warbird enthusiasts. When one appears at an air show, the distinctive roar of the R-2800 engine turns heads. People stop and watch as the massive fighter thunders past, a reminder of a time when American industrial might and pilot skill combined to create one of history's most effective weapons. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never the most glamorous fighter of World War II. That honor probably goes to the Spitfire or the Mustang. It was never the most maneuverable. It was never the most beautiful. But it was, perhaps, the most effective at the mission that mattered most: destroying the enemy and bringing its pilot home alive. The Luftwaffe learned to fear the sound of that big radial engine. They learned that engaging a P-47 meant facing 8 heavy machine guns that could shred an aircraft in seconds. They learned that shooting at a P-47 didn't necessarily mean destroying it. They learned that American pilots, flying these massive, powerful fighters, were becoming as skilled as any pilots in the world. In the end, that's what won the air war. Not just superior numbers or industrial capacity, but the combination of a superbly designed aircraft and well-trained, aggressive pilots who learned to use that aircraft to its full potential. The P-47 Thunderbolt was truly the flying tank, and it played a crucial role in winning the war in the air over Europe.